Fellas, we had an incredible interview the other day with the Podcast versus Enemies featuring Chris Proctor. Guys, if you ever just want to tune in to a podcast with just great, informative content, please check out Podcast versus Enemies. This is episode 99 with hosts Court, Impetus, and Saint, joined by Chris Proctor, who is the senior design lead at Bungie. Now, this is mainly a PvE podcast, so questions and answers will mainly revolve around that aspect of Destiny. I feel like the Firing Range podcast really touches on things like PvP, and if you ever want to check out that interview breakdown, we'll link that down below. But today's interview talks about the upcoming Into the Light update, as well as a host of PvE questions. Now, just some intros out of the way. Chris Proctor has been with Bungie since late 2019. Recently, he was promoted to Combat Area Design Lead, which includes combatants, bosses, abilities. Previously, he was the Weapons Feature Lead, but he mentioned that he'll be leaving the Weapons team, but says that it is in good hands. But I will say I love Chris's demeanor about everything. He's just extremely professional. He also understands Destiny. This is not someone that's just pulling levers just for the hell of it. He gets it, starting at the most basic level, that being our loot. Now, question one. We've seen some of the new weapons rolling with multiple main traits. How many traits can you get? And are the multi-trait drops only on the limited edition variants? Answer. Only the limited edition variants will get double traits. Regular drops don't get them. It won't be like playlist drops where resetting ranks gives the chance of multiple perks to drop. Question two. Any sort of special acquisition paths, considering the strength of some of these weapons, or will they be available on rotation similar to Nightfall loot? Now, you can attune at any point if you completed the quest, which Chris says it gives the attuned weapon a 50% chance of dropping from Onslaught chests. And the host mentions target farming loot isn't something we've seen in quite a long time, and that many of us are excited about that. And I would say, yeah, anything that can curb RNG, absolutely. Question three. Will clearing higher sets of Onslaughts or playing on higher difficulty increase your chances of getting these limited edition weapons to drop? Chris says you can increase the number of chests through higher waves and legend. So it doesn't necessarily increase the odds, but it gives you more chances with multiple chests. Now, limited edition variants only get a max of 2 traits in columns 3 and 4. You can't get any more than that. But again, that's still substantially better than just 1 trait. That's just more opportunities for us to potentially get that god roll. Question 4. When you say limited edition, just how rare are we talking? Are we talking shiny Dragonite rare? Chris says they are not that rare. Not as rare as shiny Pokemon. He says you can reasonably expect to get a handful of these while playing. Now, they are going away when the final shape launches, but you can still get the base versions. Question 5. Regarding all weapons that have been announced to be retroactively enhanceable, for non-raid weapons that will be enhanceable in the final shape, can you customize the barrel, the magazine, and the masterwork? Chris answered that you will not be able to change that. They did this for adept raid weapons, as it would be too difficult for them to compete otherwise with their non-adept fully craftable versions. But for the Into the Light weapons and others released with update 7.3.5, they will only be able to enhance the 3rd and 4th column perks. So again, guys, no ability to influence barrel perks or mag perks or even your masterwork. Now, question 6. What would the materials cost for enhancing these weapons look like? Chris believes this would be very similar to crafting raid weapons in terms of cost, but doesn't have the exact numbers. Again though, considering they're not raid weapons, spools won't be required. Question 7. Will you be able to enhance multiple traits in the same column? Get this, guys. Yes. Chris says you'll be able to enhance all 4 traits if you have a weapon with multiple traits. Now, this was part of the tech that they were waiting for in order to roll out enhanceable weapons more broadly, which is coming in the final shape. Now, it's interesting that they're going to be rolling that out more broadly, and I'm curious to see what that actually means. Will we be able to pick up any weapon, even if it's like a raw drop, and then have the ability to enhance it? Dude, can you imagine the ability to enhance a God Roll Crux? Now, question 8. What, if any, are the stat changes going to be for these weapons coming back? Chris mentioned that they only had to change up the stats for 3 of them, going on to state that Black Armory weapons already had juice stats. They increased Luna's Howl handling stats by +10. They also increased Recluse's range stat by +6. Midnight Coup got more substantial changes, including +10 to its range, +5 to its stability, and +14 to airborne effectiveness. Now get this, guys. Every weapon from Into the Light will have deterministic recoil. Now, Zaz, with Blast Furnace receiving its Rasmussen scope and having barrel options, would it not get the +2 range and +13 handling, as that was the stat bump you would get with Rasmussen subclass mutant itself. Chris confirms that yes, you will not get that added to your base stats, it's just you receiving the sight, but you'll be able to get those stats directly from the barrel perks instead. Now question 9, what are the stats on the new origin trait Indomitability, and what was the design philosophy behind it? Chris said that Into the Light is all about light and darkness, so they wanted to have an origin trait to reflect that duality. Kills on the light subclass will grant you grenade energy, and kills on the darkness subclass will grant you melee energy. Now he didn't have the numbers on hand, but it's somewhere around the same as Classic Contender, which is about 2.5%. Chris also says that it is meant to be roughly half of what you would get from Demolitionist and Pugilist on primary weapons. By the way, Demo and Pugilist are around 10%, so this means it should be about 5%, which is really good for just being an origin trait. Now those mentioned that there are some weapons that have Demolitionists, and Chris says that weapons that have Demolitionists and rocking a light subclass will be getting lots of grenade energy back, meaning these things stack. And they also went on to joke about Forbearance also having Demolitionist now, and how it was trashed before, and so it needed this origin trait. Chris mentioned that a friend of his commented that the weapon to finally power creep Forbearance is Forbearance itself. Man, it's not the only weapon here power creeping, right? Everything looks to be best in class. Question 10, what are the stats on Desperate Measures? How is it differentiated from Golden Tricorn? Now, Last Stand was the dev name for this perk in the Into the Light reveal, but keep in mind Last Stand is also the exotic trait on Vigilance Wing, so they had to change it. But the perk grants 10% damage bonus on a weapon kill and a 20% damage bonus on a grenade or melee kill, and it can stack up to 30%, lasting for 7 seconds. Now Golden Tricorn requires matching your subclass damage with your weapon damage, whereas Desperate Measures does not require that, therefore making it easier to proc. Granted, you don't get the same 50% damage buff, but more ease of use. And not only can it last for 7 seconds, but it can also be refreshed. Now it was mentioned that this perk will be enhanceable, but there was no mention of what the enhanced version does. Might just be a small bump, perhaps even just a duration increase, but we'll see. Question number 11. What was the process of redesigning Micro Missile like? How has it been designed to keep its original feel without being a menace in PvP? Chris says, around the time of Beyond Light, it was a huge problem, and although it was about to be sunset, which helped in PvE, it was still going to be a problem in PvP, so they had to nerf it. They didn't want it to go back to one-shotting players in PvP easily, from any distance, so it won't be able to do that anymore. As a result, they were able to remove previous penalties that it had. He mentions it was very inaccurate in the air, and that they removed that previous nerf. It can also now be used as a rocket jumping tool, as it just does a small amount of self-damage before launching you into the air. Now, Chris mentioned that he's sure to see PvP montages with it still. They're also cranking Breach Grenade Launcher impact damage, so it's gonna hit pretty hard. Previously, they were mainly using it for ad clear, but not for single target damage. With this change, Mount Top will be good again, as well as double fire grenade launchers. Now, I do want to mention that I do think that Mount Top will still be able to get the one-hit kill, but more than likely only with perks like Harmony being procced. The other thing that I'm wondering, will Mount Top have sticky grenades? You see, that really is what made Mount Top so good. Yes, the one-hit kills were phenomenal, but the sticky grenade shots to lock down an area or to hit somebody's feet and then they step over it, that was so good. I literally used Mount Top as a means of trapping my opponents. I'm curious if the new updated version of Mount Top will still have sticky grenades. Question number 12. Will the Breach Grenade Launcher buff be for PvE specifically? Chris says there's a bunch of scaling going on, but they changed the baseline behavior, then detuned the PvP damage, which Chris says is the opposite of how they normally tune things, with PvP being the base damage and then scaling it from there. Chris says they reworked the Micro Missiles intrinsic, as randomly rolling that trait on other grenade launchers would have been weird, and this gives them the option to release more Micro Missile frames in the future if they want. And you see this across the board, guys, where they're expanding on archetypes that we previously thought they forgot. From our aggressive scout rifles to the double fire grenade launchers, we're probably going to get something similar to Warden's Law and that archetype at some point. Our arsenal has to keep evolving, which means more archetypes. Now, question 13. It was explained on the live stream that Luna's Howl with Magnificent Howl can still get the 2-tap, it just will require more work. Now they ask, how does Magnificent Howl work? Specifically, the high damage shots activated after a reload. Chris says each shot does the increased damage for how many activations you have procced. No delay or anything. Now he goes on to say that with it being procced, your crit damage jumps up to 120, which means if you do that back to back, that's an easy 2-tap. And if you get a bunch of shots queued up, you can also do a huge amount of damage in PvE as well. Now he goes on to say that it has pretty high utility and there is no timer. Fellas, the main thing to take away from this is that Luna's Howl and its 2-tapping is back and better than ever. The other question we have is, what about Lucky Pants? Come on, man. I need to know if it stacks. Now, question 14. Will there be an enhanceable version of Magnificent Howl? Why, yes, there will be. But Chris also goes on to say they haven't decided what the enhanced version of Magnificent Howl will do yet. And they asked about its use in PvE. Chris says it works pretty well. We're taking out some ads, then reloading to get that big damage versus major enemies. They also asked about it being a precision frame, but also a 140 round per minute hand cannon. Chris actually says because of this, it has a massive bump in its airborne effectiveness, matching that of other 180 round per minute hand cannons. It also has very manageable recoil, but yes, it is still a 140. Question 15. Any details on the potential return of Not Forgotten? That was also name dropped in the dev article. Now, Chris says there was nothing specific, but wanted to save Not Forgotten when there was a chance for it to stand and shine on its own, rather than being part of a larger set of weapons. Fellas, it almost sounds like they're gauging to see how Not Forgotten is going to sit in the current sandbox, with Luna's Howl rolling out first, and then potentially pushing Not Forgotten out as a competitive reward. We'll see though. Question 16. Could Master of Arms and Magnificent Howl potentially show up on other weapons in the future? Chris says yes. They see these perks similar to introducing a new perk for a raid, where they wanted to be exclusive for a while, then it will start to show up on other weapons. Now, I expect it to be exclusive here for at least a few releases, but sometime in the year of the final shape, you will see it on other weapons. And they provide examples like using Master of Arms on other archetypes, or Magnificent Howl being used on a 180 round per minute hand cannon, which means we're back at 3-tap city. Now, here's the thing. You may be wondering, Cross, if that's the case, why didn't they keep Luna's Howl on 180? Yeah, it's interesting that they even tried it out, but they did mention the other day that Magnificent Howl on a 180 in its current form is too strong. So I wonder if they're actually going to change it depending on the archetype. Again, traits are static across archetypes, but imagine if they could change it depending on the weapon type it rolls on. Instead of it being like a 30% buff, maybe it's a 20% buff. And we've seen this with other various perks, but for the most part, it's been a static percentage bump when it comes to most of our weapons. Now, question 17. Was there a thought of making Mountaintop Recluse and Luna's Howl an exotic, similar to the D1 mentality? Chris says it did come up a lot, and it's frequently suggested by the community. But he says the problem is the performance is not quite exotic. The strength is there, but you couldn't substitute it for something unique like Dragon's Breath or Revision Zero. Those weapons feel unique. They don't think legendaries, even with an exotic-like trait, quite hits the exotic mark, and that they're more willing to make new subfamilies for legendaries feel more special, rather than to make a spicy legendary into an exotic. I have to agree with this, guys. Again, we reached that point in Destiny where it was like, all right, all these raid weapons, Atheon's Epilogue, Word of Crota, and a number of other weapons that are very strong that were legendaries, we're just gonna turn them into exotics. And in my opinion, they're just not unique enough to just be an exotic. Again, exotic doesn't necessarily mean super lethal. It's that exotic factor, that unique factor that makes it the rarity that it is. Question 18. Was there any concern that bringing back existing raid weapons might undermine the originals? Chris said they discussed this quite a bit, including things like whether they should have the exact same roles or be something entirely different. And they determined no one would want these new versions of these weapons if they had the exact same roles. I agree. Also, the thought of updating the raid versions instead, but with different perks, says that won't work either because people already have those weapons, most notably the craftable versions. So ultimately, they decided to update the perk pools on the new versions in a relatively small way, with them leaning on the origin trait to make that difference. In some cases, the raid origin traits are better depending on the activity, so we'll have to weigh the pros and cons of each of these roles. Now, he also brought up that they're fairly old, and it was time for a bit of a refresh for these weapons. The hope is also to give a bit of an intro to the type of weapons you can get from doing the raids, and to encourage players to try them out. That's exactly what I figured Bungie was doing here. Again, this is a free event, but what Bungie is trying to pitch here is like, hey, all right, we're gonna give people a taste of Forbearance and Succession, and hopefully some of those players that have not bought those expansions with those associated raids will buy them to go after those weapons based on the experience they've had with these versions of these weapons. Now, question 19. Could Kinetic Tremors be tweaked per subfamily or to proc on mag percentage like Target Lock? Chris said this is something on the table, and he's actually going to pass the feedback on. But there is a bit of a problem. He goes on to say that they can do tuning per weapon type or magazine size, but that you can't easily combine the two, which is interesting because this kind of gives you an idea of what the limitations are when it comes to weapon tuning inside of Destiny. Question 20. There was some controversy on some of the weapons coming back. What were some of the weapons that didn't quite make the cut for Into the Light? Chris says that they gathered suggestions from within Bungie as well as player requests from over the years, ultimately ending up around 40 weapons, which is quite a bit. Then they had to figure out how many they can reasonably make, which ended up being the 12 we see here. here. Now, some of the weapons they unfortunately had to cut include weapons like Chroma Rush, which was a fantastic auto rifle from Season the Splicer, first in, last out, which Chris mentioned was the first weapon he worked on, but would rather just ship another really good slug shotgun. Dust Rock Blues, similar reason. What a classic though, right? Dude, I would so farm for a Dust Rock Blue, being a precision shotgun. 21% Delirium was also brought up, but Chris mentioned they would rather ship it as a Gambit playlist weapon or a ritual weapon in the future. Fatebringer was also mentioned, but it was decided to limit things to only 2 hand cannons. They also considered Dire Promise, but they couldn't do that over Midnight Coup or Luna's Howl. Wastelander was also mentioned. Anti-OPD was also mentioned, but he did say that at some point it's just going to ship as a Hake weapon, as it rightfully is. Trophy Hunter was mentioned, which is personally one of my favorite sniper rifles ever, but he did mention it didn't quite hit the mark of iconic or meta, but he hopes to see it come back as well. Aaron Till was also mentioned and said it was super meta at one point, but kind of the same thing, not as iconic. Now, he did mention that the cost to bring back weapons varies. As the older they are, the more costly they are to bring back. Question 21. What was it like to update and redesign one of the oldest weapons in Destiny? That being the Stranger's Rifle, now being dubbed Elsie's Rifle. Chris says it was really interesting. They wanted to do 1 to 2 Destiny 1 weapons, and they looked for weapons they could easily bring forward. Now, they weren't able to do anything they didn't have the source art for, as it would be too costly for the scope of this update, as it would be like making a brand new weapon. They had the source art for Elsie's Rifle though, and an artist was able to turn it around quickly for Destiny 2. Question 22. This one revolved around deterministic recoil versus recoil direction, as that's a stat in the game currently. And it was mentioned that it could be a bit confusing, but the question was asked, how do you think deterministic recoil landed overall? Now, Mercury's actually touched on this a bit in the Firing Range podcast. Chris thinks though that the system has enough promise to persist. Now, Chris acknowledged the disconnect for how the recoil stat was treated by players previously versus how deterministic recoil actually feels in the game. He says the stat is still doing what it says in the game. Certain numbers pushing to the left, some pushing to the right. Chris says though, if you have a deterministic recoil pattern that already pushes to the right, and then you have a stat that also pushes it to the right, then it's gonna push it even further to the right. And if your deterministic recoil is pushing to the left, but a stat that you have is pushing it to the right, then it therefore will be more centered. Now, he does mention this is not necessarily an ideal situation, but it is delivering on their goal to make weapons feel more unique and have players be able to learn the recoil of a weapon, and that they're looking to find ways to more easily surface that information to players. The main takeaway I get on that one, guys, is that it's still good to just line them up against a wall and shoot your weapon. Literally just blow your load and see where it goes and make adjustments from there. Question 23. Can you provide any specifics on the upcoming chain reaction nerf on specials? Chris says it's less of a nerf and more of a branching out of the perk itself, this being branched to other weapons. He says that special weapons will have 15% smaller detonation radius and do 20% less damage. Heavy weapons will have the same radius, but deal 30% more damage than it does now, which is wild. Now, Chris says heavy grenade launchers with chain reaction will be significantly better at ad clear than special grenade launchers. But he goes on to say that he wants to see this perk on things like pellet shotguns, which sounds wild. Can you imagine running in there, getting a kill with your shotgun, and having chain reaction proc? I will say the more you think about it, kind of makes sense. Question 24. It was mentioned that Chill Clip was teased to be getting tweaked in the final shape, and could any details be provided on that? Chris said that they're adjusting it and are aware that the nerf didn't really affect it on the most powerful weapon, that being Riptide, but it really hurt the other weapons. Riptide will still require 3 shots to freeze, but slower firing fusions will only require 2 shots. And all other archetypes with Chill Clip will be unnerved, also requiring just 2 shots. And he mentions that just the super fast firing weapons are the only ones that need 3 shots. They want to see how it goes first though, with this change to Chill Clip, before making any other adjustments. Now, I was also asked, is Riptide a weapon Bungie would bring back in the future with a set of different perks? But Chris says Riptide, although being meta, isn't necessarily iconic. Question 25. Any details on upcoming changes for underperforming exotic weapons? Now, Chris said there are some changes coming with Into the Light, but he's not going to drop them now as the update is just a few weeks away. But Queenbreaker's bow is already situationally good according to Chris, since it's on-demand blind, but they are increasing its damage versus bosses, mini-bosses, champions, and vehicles by 12% and increasing the reserve ammo by 3. Now, Chris says this should put it past the best legendary linear fusion rifles in terms of damage. Now, Court asked about Queenbreaker's selectable scopes. And if they are still stained, Chris says they investigated putting that on a special reload, but there's a technical issue preventing them from swapping which scope you have in actual gameplay. Guys, for those wondering what he's talking about, essentially, Bungie wants us to have the ability to swap our scopes on the fly, similar like Horde Light swapping the elemental types. Now, Chris goes on to mention truth. He said that it had one major problem due to its grenade and horseshoes perk only doing AoE damage and not getting impact damage. So they're looking to increase the AoE damage to compensate, essentially doing full rocket damage that will just be AoE. They also increased its reserves by 3, which is on top of the reserve buff that High Impacts just received. So again, guys, this is an individual buff that's about to be handing out the truth, which sounds wild. But then he brought up Colony. I know for many of you, you probably haven't heard of that exotic in years, but Chris mentions it will now spawn additional insectoid robots on those insectoid final blows. On red bar enemies on kills, it will spawn an insectoid robot, but it has a cooldown. On tougher enemies, like a boss for instance, it will spawn 5 insectoid robots. But he mentions when you start to kill tougher enemies, it's hilarious because you start to see just these wave of insectoids just running around. But he does say that these type of abilities are called ground follow projectiles. Then proceeded to ask the host what else they would like to see converted into these, of which they replied they would love to see a worm spawn out of parasites, slowly making its way toward an enemy, then blowing up. And to our surprise, Chris actually said that he'll be looking into it. Then they asked about Necrochasm's 1 for Thrall trait. Again, this is the update to the exotic catalyst on Necrochasm. Chris confirms it is still coming in the final shape. Question 26. Any news on a Tesselation Catalyst? Chris mentioned that it will get one in the final shape, but he cannot reveal what it is, but that we will be finding out very soon. But yes, it will interact with our subclass and our abilities. Question 27. It was asked why bait and switch would proc on the first landed hit. Is that just a weird timing impact? Chris actually said that this is a networking issue between the server and the client that can happen on perks that are triggered by something other than kills. So occasionally, the shot that is supposed to be proccing bait and switch will sometimes get the buff. There was a similar issue on Dead Man's Tale before, which is why its damage bonus was reworked, but they're going to be looking to address this. Honestly, it almost sounds like double damage, right? Like if you ever been in a Crucible fight and someone's shooting you and you just go from like full health to nothing and like 2 hand cannon shots, that's double damage. And it's literally when the guy on the other end shoots a shot and for some reason it'll count for 2. Now listen, don't be going out there saying, oh my God, that's why I lose all my 1v1s. It doesn't happen that often, but it is a networking problem. And I wonder if that's also applying here. Now question 28. This was a question about our sword, the Slammer. Most notably, the perk on it, Cold Steel. The question was asked, is it supposed to be applying slow stacks every tick within a heavy attack, or just once per heavy attack? Chris says that it's supposed to only proc once per heavy attack. Now look, this is interesting because the one saving grace for Slammer in our damage test was that Cold Steel is still a very unique trait here. We'll be having to do testing on this once they make their adjustment, but to me this sounds like a nerf. Question 29. Could Chris give any information on the weapon subfamilies that are coming in the final shape? Chris replied that he would love to, but that he can't. But that information will be coming relatively soon. Question 30. Will there be more Rocket Sidearms? Again, one of the weapons I have stated as a must-have weapon for this season is this Rocket Sidearm right here, guys, Indebted Kindness. You can check out our review if you want, but please get this weapon. It is in a class of its own. It is that good. Now, Chris mentions here there are 2 coming in the final shape. One will be a solar, the other one will be a strand Rocket Sidearm. And he says they are extremely spicy. Now, for those worried about a potential nerf, Chris mentions that he thinks that this archetype launched in a really good state, and that there was a reason they were shown in the final shape showcase. Chris was the one who designed Indebted Kindness because he knew this season's weapons would be the last set of weapons he would get to work on. Question 31. Looking back at the Lightfall year of content, how is Bungie feeling about roguelike mechanics in seasonal content? Chris says it's not his area, but he does know that there's a lot of excitement surrounding those mechanics internally, and there's likely to be more exploration of them to come. Now, question 32. Can you tell us about the playing card weapon set featured in the final shape? Again, like the rest of this, guys, all Chris could say is that more about those will be revealed to us fairly soon. Question 33. Are there any traits that sounded simple to create but were difficult to implement, or vice versa? Chris says that Dawning Surprise was actually fairly complex to implement, with it spawning the present in the world, whether it spawns in for everyone or just the player, and essentially just how it works in general. And he also mentions the weird conditions and networking issues like bait and switch, as well as Hawkmoon's perks. Conditional finality was also a weird one with its changing elements. builds and how it interacts with things like armor mods. Now, a perk Chris thought was going to be difficult was Indomitability, with it needing to check if you're on a light or darkness subclass, but said it only took a few hours to put together. Now, one of the first perks he made was Chain Reaction. It was made to be like Firefly and Dragonfly, but of course not needing precision hits. Now, he thought it would be difficult, but it ended up being just spawn the Dragonfly explosion on kills and don't let it trigger off of itself. Honestly, guys, this bit of insight is probably great for my potential developers out there. Like just listening to this, seeing from a veteran in the game what did present issues and what didn't. Question 34. How are you feeling about the reserve changes to rocket launchers and heavy grenade launchers? Chris says they're pretty happy with the heavy weapon balance overall. He still thinks rockets are a bit too spicy compared to everything else and wouldn't be surprised to see rockets either come down a bit or other types of heavies come up a bit. And they have a sweeping PvE balance pass coming in the final shape. But it's a little too early to talk about it just yet, but you can expect more changes. And guys, that's extremely important because that first week and a half, we're scrambling. We're trying to find what it is that's going to be meta in the raid. So if there's going to be some big sweeping changes, this means that first week, we're going to be doing damage tests literally every day. Now, he goes on to say that a long time ago, they had a blog post about the intended use cases for certain subfamilies, whether it was ad clear, DPS, burst damage, single target, sustained damage, etc. Now, Chris was asked if this has changed at all. He says that they pushed those weapons more into their intended use cases and haven't intentionally changed their intended roles. They had to be pretty stubborn about machine guns to get players to start using them for things like tough ad clearing and single target damage. But he goes on to say he doesn't think anything is just straight garbage in terms of heavy weapons. Cough, cough, Darcy. Come on, Bungie, just make it a special at this point. It's just embarrassing right now. Question 35. What is your favorite exotic weapon ornament? From Chris here, the 30th anniversary DMT ornament is his favorite, as well as the Dreaming City Forerunner ornament. I gotta say, both of those are very sexy. He also mentions that the Traveler's Chosen Dreaming City ornament is another favorite. Question 36. What is your favorite sound design for a weapon that you've worked on? He mentions Asio Striga was his favorite, as he came up with the concept first, and then talked to a sound designer about his idea of a stream of corrupted insects at a target, and he wanted to hear them wailing, and he loves how it came out. And the most surprising one was Dead Man's Tale, which had the same sound designer as Hawkmoon, but wanted a tail sign from when you have 5 stacks, and it does that little cowboy whistle. Fun fact, this was recorded in the sound designer's bathroom. You gotta love it, man. Question 37. What is a weapon you would want to lift out of another franchise and put it into Destiny? Chris says they've already done this a bunch of times. He names Rocket Sidearms from a certain franchise, Tiku's Divination, was if Legolas had a magical solar bow, but something that he would like is a fully automatic crossbow from Van Helsing. Question 38. What games does Chris play outside of Destiny? Chris says he's playing a lot of Helldivers 2. Spreading that democracy? Now, he said he was a huge fan of the first game. He just started Dragon's Dogma 2 though. He's also been playing through Cyberpunk 2077. And he says that they have some of the best weapon feel outside of Bungie games, which I do agree. Chris, if you're listening, please try out Terry. You won't be let down. And question 39. Our final question here, guys. This was a question from Chris. What is everyone gonna run for their day 1 final shape raid? Court replied Void Hunter. Impetus replied Solar Warlock. Sane replied that team survivability was the most important, with him either rocking Phoenix Cradle or Precious Scars. And for damage, Pyrogil or Worm God with 1-2 punch strand type. But Chris replied that if you're looking for survivability, you should try the new support auto rifle when it launches. It carries. So guys, that is our interview breakdown of the podcast versus enemies interview. It was an excellent interview. Big shout out to the host here and for Chris Proctor for laying out so much information for us. If you're interested in that podcast, a link to that will be down below. I urge you to go check it out. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching. And as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.